Tony Stark is arguably the glue that held the Marvel Cinematic Universe together to the 11-year span that people didn't call it garbage. He was down to earth, but also extravagant, an ordinary man capable of extraordinary things. He could be funny and loose and charming, but he also knew when to turn the quips off and take a moment seriously. General audiences went from knowing absolutely nothing about him and nothing particularly good about the actor that played him to unabashedly adoring him in the span of one movie, turning Stark into a household name in the best way, to a point where it's impossible to think of the MCU lineup without him. So logically, when audiences were forced to try to think of the MCU lineup without him, the results have ranged from middling to mind-numbing to no end. Kevin Feige's plan to move forward with the MCU following Tony Stark's demise has hit several road bumps, to say the least. And on top of that, Robert Downey Jr.'s plan to move forward to greater things have ranged from "yay, I won an Oscar" to "what the f*** was I smoking?" It seems like both could really help each other out at this point, and after failing to connect with the characters Marvel has thrown out there, I doubt audiences would be opposed to the idea either, so it only seems fitting and beneficial in every direction to bring both parties together, right?
Bad idea.
Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to seeing the character again. I, like many of you, followed the series and stuck to it from day one through the Infinity Saga mostly because of him. He's held the series up on his shoulders, and plus, on top of himself not being opposed to the idea, even claiming it's in his DNA, it's not like it would be out of left field to bring him back. I mean, when has anyone stayed dead in any of these movies? I also get that today's lineup of characters hasn't come anywhere near connecting with today's audiences as Tony did early on in the series. Too many characters, from Shang-Chi to Moon Knight to Hulk to the Eternals, have been crammed into audiences' faces, with the X-Men, Fantastic Four, and Blade, probably, maybe, if the planets align, still underway, which wouldn't be so bad except that none of them have truly landed with audiences as much as Tony Stark did. They made for fun romps of stories, but every bland, uninspired attempt to recreate the success of the original MCU roster just continues to bore audiences further and further, to a point where they start to shout out, "These characters suck, bring back this old character we love." In fact, I would go as far as to say that their recent poor handling of not only new characters like She-Hulk and Moon Knight, but returning champions like Thor and Doctor Strange has caused such a disconnection with audiences that it begs the question, do you really want a broken system at Marvel Studios that has turned your beloved Thor from an elegant Shakespearean god into a loopy Looney Tune of a cartoon character to take this incredibly charismatic lead that we all put on a pedestal of greatness in terms of movie characters, let alone comic book characters? I figured as much, but I think there is a way that he can help. As beloved as he is nowadays, and as easy as it is to roll back onto his greener grass with our weed-infested patch of crap, the thing people forget is that he wasn't always this beloved. Hardcore comic book fans probably knew who he was, but unlike icons like Batman or Spider-Man, who were well known far across pop culture around the time their movies got made, neither the names Iron Man, Tony Stark, nor Robert Downey Jr. were known by general audiences at all until his first movie came out. For his charm and charisma, both the actor and the character skyrocketed into insane popularity in the span of 2 hours, when before that, nobody knew who either were at all. To say that we need to dismiss current nobodies like Moon Knight or Shang-Chi and bring back this somebody that we hold up now is the equivalent of saying at the time of the first Iron Man's release, "This character sucks, give me some more Spider-Man." Oh wait, he sucks right now too. Point being, a character can and has gone from a nobody to a somebody with just one movie, and if Tony Stark was the only character to do this, I would consider it lightning in a bottle. But it happened 4 times. 4 freaking times! Not to mention all the other times after that, and one of those times, I might add, actually made a comeback and took a nosedive. Marvel had a system down for a while for taking characters that most of us were unfamiliar with and giving them life, charisma, charm, heart, and passion that allowed us to connect with them throughout their 11-year streak of unabashed quality. If we can get back to that system instead of whatever the hell's been going on throughout as well as after the pandemic, I think this slew of new characters could have a shot. I think that Tony Stark, above anything else, can serve as an inspiration for how to get these characters on his same track rather than trying to get Stark himself on their track. Because let's face it, the hate train is going to ram him there too. Because at the end of the day, I believe what we miss isn't necessarily Stark himself, but a character or set of characters that we can latch onto as much as we have Stark. And whether it's with currently established characters or any new upcoming characters, I firmly believe through 3 simple steps we can connect with a new set of characters just as well as we did Tony Stark. Number 1. Start your characters more down to earth. Tony was a relatable character, and a good chunk of his relatability came from the fact that at the end of the day, he was just an average everyday man, one with money and brains and clearly capable of greater things, but still a real down-to-earth person, and we got to know him as a real person a good half hour before he even conceived his iron suit. This was essential because at the end of the day, we don't connect with iron suits or flashy effects, we connect with ordinary people. And on top of that, we're inspired by ordinary people doing extraordinary things because it helps us to feel like we're capable of doing those extraordinary things ourselves. In fact, I would go as far as to say my favorite of the Iron Man movies was the one where he did a lot more as Tony Stark than he did as Iron Man. Not saying all superheroes have to be ordinary like that, but they do have to be, first and foremost, relatable in order for us to make a connection. And it tremendously helps when we get to know them as people before we get to know them as superheroes. That right there is where a lot of recent characters have been stumbling. Shang-Chi, for instance, barely talks to anybody. Heck, we hear more dialogue from his mom and Aquafina than we do from him before he starts whooping ass on the bus. She-Hulk doesn't even give us the second to breathe before she starts yapping to the camera. Literally, the first scene of Moon Knight is him waking up strapped to his bed. First scene, and I'm already out of his headspace. But that problem doesn't just stop at newcomers. Many of the returning characters kick off their movies and shows out of their headspace, and while Hawkeye and Shuri do this in a reasonable manner after transpiring events, characters like Wanda and Thor purposefully start off their show and movie, respectively, on their own freaking planet, which again is properly established, albeit for Wanda not until much later on, but it creates an instant disconnection with audiences that keeps some audiences hooked just so they can get an answer to this madness, but turns the majority of audiences off and leaves a bad taste in their mouths. Tony Stark was everybody's flavor from the very first frame he was in. You saw him, you loved him, you understood him, and you instantly connected with him. That's what's missing with these characters. That's what we need in these characters. Number 2, make more timely use of your character. This one goes in addition with the prerequisite of the characters being likable, which is covered in the other 2 steps, but it was a prominent part of Stark and a big problem with these other characters. That being that, despite only having 3 movies of his titular own, Stark was an extremely prominent character in the MCU, to the point where most people can't think of the MCU without him. And a big part of that was that, at least since Age of Ultron, he's made prominent appearances in the Marvel movies at least once a year, and more often than not, played essential roles in the movies he was in. In Age of Ultron, he made Ultron. In Spider-Man Homecoming, he served as a role model for Peter Parker. It's one big reason why he was considered the glue that held the MCU together, because without him, all the movies and thus the cinematic universe would fall apart. The MCU movies and shows now are designed less to have requirements for prominent overarching characters to serve as glue, but without at least one, they feel less like a compelling cinematic universe as a whole and more like separate divisive movies and shows. Fun ones, but separate and detached nevertheless. A prime example of this, Shang-Chi. We saw his movie, it was a hit, broke box office record, and then we never saw him again. We saw his mom in What If Season 2, but he himself has been dead in the water ever since his one-hit wonder. The same thing happened with Moon Knight, except whereas Shang-Chi at least got to meet Captain Marvel and Hulk at the end of his movie, audiences got to the end of Moon Knight still scratching their heads wondering what the heck the character was even doing in the universe. And we're still currently wondering that. Some characters either got follow-ups like Miss Marvel and Photon appearing in the Marvels, or are in the process of getting follow-ups like Falcon getting to take up his shield in his own upcoming Captain America movie following Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but that trajectory as a whole lacks any kind of connective glue that ties everything as a whole together. Some people have pointed out that Wong is making frequent appearances and will most likely be some kind of connective tissue, but relying on him would kind of be like if the Infinity Saga relied solely on someone like Coulson to connect its movies together. These movies and shows need a stronger glue than that, a stronger narrative focal point to give the series more consistent energy, and that, among everything else, is the role that Tony Stark served to keep the Infinity Saga tied together. They may be trying to fix up Falcon to be that, or it could be Spider-Man or Doctor Strange, but whatever the case, we need somebody to take up that role. Number 3, and this is drastically important, balance out the yin with the yang. The number one complaint about the MCU right now, bigger than effects, oversaturation, or anything else, is that it's too heavily reliant on humor, but no one could ever argue that being a problem with Tony Stark. He was funny, he was always funny, and there was never any point when anybody thought he wasn't fun. Okay, that one time. But for the most part, no one could argue detrimentally against the idea of tying him with the quips that people had claimed to have enough of nowadays. The key to his quips, though, compared to something like Thor Love and Thunder, is that he wasn't overbearing with it. He could make a good quip, but he also knew when to take a moment seriously and drop his comedy routine. Whether it was straightening out his mentor or grieving with his newfound friends, his experience facing death at point-blank range gave him the perspective he needed to not treat everything like a joke. But he also knew not to be a humdrum about everything either. Not everything was a joke, as some ice cream shops should be told, but the things that were, he took full-fledged advantage of, and that was part of his ability to keep the energy up, but not through the roof. He kept a perfect balance that kept the momentum of the MCU going without sending it over the rails. I can't think of a single multiverse saga character, old or new, that has struck anywhere near that balance, except for Miss Marvel, but of course no one saw her show. You of course have Thor, Ant-Man, She-Hulk, or the Steven's side of Moon Knight that are full-fledged cartoon characters, but you also have characters like Shang-Chi, Falcon, Shuri, all the Eternals, or the Mark side of Moon Knight that treat everything like a frickin' funeral. Probably because a lot of Phase 4 was a funeral, but now that we're past that, can we get the momentum back? Like, not everything has to be a joke, but not everything has to be a trip to the DMV either. Just let your characters be characters for once. Show your light side as well as your dark side, and not in some weird, deranged, split personality way. What made Tony feel real is that we saw both his light and his dark. And again, if he were translated into Marvel's current system, chances are he would have veered too far into his dark side or too far into his goofball territory. They've done it once, they can do it again. But balance is part of what made Tony Stark so likable, and it can work just as easily for these characters as it did with him. So bring some sense back to these characters and loosen up these characters, and we should be on the right track. Now, none of this is to say that Tony Stark returning to the MCU would necessarily hurt the MCU, but one, it wouldn't resolve any of the issues at hand, and two, it would just subject his character to them. They would have made him too jokey. I mean, it's happened once. They would have put him in one Avengers film and we may have seen him again like 5 years later. I could see that happening. And he would have felt disconnected and totally out of his headspace. It's like Jack Sparrow all over again. But the fact that he started as a nobody and became a somebody in the span of one movie tells me that it's completely possible with all these other characters as well. We know they've worked as characters in the comics, so they've already proven themselves to work as characters in general. And again, Marvel clearly has a passionate interest in utilizing these characters in some way, shape, or form, which in and of itself is not a bad move. They just lost touch on how to pull that off in the right way, and that's what I wanted to bring back to life. If Marvel wants to bring Tony Stark back, that's up to them. If Robert Downey Jr. wants to come back as Tony, I mean, the man won an Oscar, he can do whatever the hell he wants. But Marvel has failed on several occasions, with old and new characters alike, to treat their characters like relatable, balanced, prominent characters. So if they're not going to fix that problem, why should I trust they do the same with Tony? The problem hasn't been what characters they get, the problem has been how they treat those characters. Tony was indeed the glue that held the MCU together, but he didn't necessarily get that way on his own. I mean, we've seen how much he can stumble without proper support. He got there because these creatives knew how to keep him balanced and allow him to connect with audiences. Aspects that could, with proper TLC, be plugged into these new characters to give the MCU a newfound sense of energy. That's what audiences are missing. Not Stark, but Stark's energy. The feeling of being surprised at how charming and likable a character can be out of nowhere with no proven background. I'd actually make the argument that's more likely to happen with these new characters. But he can certainly stand as an inspiration on how to bring that energy to these new characters. And really, that's what I feel like Marvel should be, and probably is, more so pressing towards. I love you 3000, Tony, but it's time to move on.